Welcome to the Smart Apartment Advisor Show. I'm JJ Panzer, your host, and I'm on a mission to help property owners get smart about property management. Today, our guest is Clifford Fried, partner at the firm Fried and Williams, and a friend of the rental property business for over 30 years. Clifford's practice focuses on leasing law, rent control, and occupancy issues. He has handled hundreds of trials and appeals in his career. He lectures on various real property issues and writes for several local apartment magazines and publications. He maintains the highest ratings by Avvo and Martindale-Hubbell and was named super lawyer by San Francisco Magazine. Clifford's practice has been focused on real estate litigation and the defense of the rights of landlords. He has done this by representing his clients in trial and appellate courts at mediations, arbitrations, rent board hearings, and planning and labor commissions. I'm pleased to introduce Clifford Fried. Welcome to the show, Clifford.
Good morning, JJ.
It's good to have you. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about the Costa-Hawkins law at the state level and some current efforts to repeal and challenge that law. And we're going to talk about why that's important and how you can help us fight that effort. And then we're going to talk, the bulk of our conversation today is going to be about buyouts. Clifford has lots of great data and experience and anecdotes to talk about buyouts and about what they mean and how they work. So let's start with the conversation about Costa-Hawkins. That's sort of the sore thumb in the landlord community these days. Tell me a little bit about what is Costa-Hawkins and why should we care?
All right, so the sore thumb is not Costa-Hawkins, but the repeal of Costa-Hawkins. Exactly. So first of all, Costa-Hawkins was a law that was passed many years ago, 1995, and amended in 2001, which said that cities like San Francisco cannot have rent control in certain situations. No rent control on most single-family homes, no rent control on new construction, no rent control on vacant units. So if there's a repeal of those prohibitions, it's going to have a dramatic impact on property owners in San Francisco and elsewhere in the state of California where rent control exists.
Right, and that's important because the state law takes precedence over the local law, and it makes it so that the local activists and politicians have to go to the state level to try to get repeal so that they can enact laws that would be more punitive and more restrictive at the local level. What would be some of the negative effects of repealing those ordinances?
Well, Costa-Hawkins has been credited with keeping the marketplace of housing flowing. And people, when people move on and move out of an apartment, the landlord gets to increase rent, which helps subsidize the rent controlled apartments in the building.
Right.
But if Costa-Hawkins was repealed, that's going to have a dramatic effect on the construction of new housing in California, which would be devastating at this point in time with all these studies coming out about how there's a tremendous shortage of housing, both for tenants and for homeowners. So new development is going to come to a screeching halt, maybe even development that's ongoing right now, because those ongoing projects were dreamt up with certain numbers in mind and the ability to receive certain rents for the units. And if Costa-Hawkins is repealed, then local cities will have a right to limit the rents on that new construction, limit the rents on vacant units, and it's going to throw off a lot of the calculations that developers have in place. And they'll just go elsewhere. They'll go outside of the state of California to create new housing. And it's going to have a dramatic effect on the existing supply of housing, because landlords are going to say, well, if I can't earn a decent rate of return, I'm just going to take the units off the market, either by using the Ellis Act or not renting out units when they become vacant. They'll fill them with family members.
So what's the current state of this challenge at the state level right now? Where are we?
So former San Francisco Supervisor David Chu proposed a bill, co-authored a bill with some other folks in the state assembly. That's Assembly Bill 1506. And at the moment it's stalled out. It's a 2-year bill, but it still could come to the attention of lawmakers. It could pass, but in the unlikely event that it doesn't pass, there are rumors that the tenant rights advocates will be putting a ballot measure before the voters on a statewide ballot measure. And it's a simple piece of legislation. It's going to say Costa-Hawkins is hereby repealed. So that ballot measure could come up as early as 2018. but there might be some delay until 2019 or 2020 when there'll be a larger voter turnout in the state of California. So there's a serious effort to repeal Costa-Hawkins, either legislatively in Sacramento or on a statewide ballot measure.
At the state level, what kind of support do we anticipate this kind of a measure would have? I mean, I would think that anybody outside of a rent-controlled jurisdiction would bristle at the thought of more regulation being possible in their community. Is there any polling on this at this time?
Not that I'm aware of, but generally half of the communities in California have some form of rent control. Half of the units have some form of rent control. And it may boil down to are there more tenants than homeowners in the state of California?
Or who turn out to vote.
And who turn out to vote. That has a big impact on the way things will go as well. But hopefully through a lot of education, tenant voters will realize that repealing Costa-Hawkins is not a good thing.
Right.
Our current governor, Jerry Brown, doesn't feel that a repeal is a wise thing to do. So there are a lot of people that are come out who are supporters of tenants' rights who may come out against a repeal of Costa-Hawkins. And it's going to take a lot of education, and educating voters, both landlord and tenant voters, is going to take money.
Yeah.
And it's important for the industry to start their efforts at fundraising to fight the repeal of Costa-Hawkins.
So how do we help out? How can we support the efforts to keep Costa-Hawkins on the legal docket?
Well, first thing is landlords should pay attention. Supporters of Costa-Hawkins should pay attention to legislative and ballot measures that are coming up, and listen to what the trade organizations are saying. They're going to be fundraisers by the San Francisco Apartment Association, and that is a place where if landlords want to make donations to fight the repeal, they can make donations to the San Francisco Apartment Association.
So we're going to include information about how to make a contribution to the San Francisco Apartment Association's legal fund in the comments and at the end of the video. So look out for that opportunity to help the San Francisco Apartment Association fight for your rights as a property owner and keep Costa-Hawkins as a part of state law. Now, let's move on and talk about buyouts. This is sort of the much more interesting and fun topic, and there's a lot to get into. So let's just start with what's a buyout and why should property owners care about buyouts at all?
So a buyout is where a property owner is paying a tenant to give up possession of the unit. They're paying for the tenant to vacate. That's what a buyout is. And there's usually an agreement. Hopefully it's going to be in writing, memorializing what the terms of the buyout are. And it's very important for owners and tenants to have the ability to enter in these buyout agreements because it takes the risk and the uncertainties out of eviction actions. Right. A lot of tenants want to know what their future is going to be in a unit, if the unit is being sold, or right. if an owner has a child or another family member that wants to move into the unit. So, in the past, landlords and tenants would fight in court over possession of a unit. And going to court is expensive because you're paying lawyers. Right. Both sides are paying lawyers in some way. And the outcomes are very uncertain. Although landlords probably win 99% of all the eviction cases in court, that 1% creates a lot of uncertainty for landlords. You can remove that uncertainty by doing a buyout of a tenant where both sides agree and go away happy.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the math on that. I mean, if you figure you have a 99 out of 100 chance of being successful, the 1% can certainly be the thing that terrorizes you. But what does it cost in terms of attorney's fees to pursue your rights under that 99%? I mean, the general cost of going to a jury trial, where does that measure up in the process? And can you just sort of account for that as being a payment to the tenant for the certainty of not going through the legal process?
Absolutely. So it's hard to predict how much a landlord will pay in legal fees because it depends on how much a fight the tenant is putting up. Right. And there are a lot of free lawyers available to tenants. Right. They're free. The taxpayer.
Free to the tenant, but not free to the owner.
No. Very few landlord attorneys are giving away their services. But there are free services available to the tenants. Right. And a tenant could just sit back and say, well, take my case to trial, I think I'll win. Right. And that throws the economics out of whack for the landlord. And the tenant attorney community, they know that, so they're constantly threatening trial, jury trials and delaying things, and that drives up the cost of litigation. Well, you can take that cost out of the equation by just going to the tenant and say, look, I don't want to give that money to Mr. Fried. Why don't I just give the money to you and you get out?
Right.
And tenants are very receptive to those kinds of deals. A little too receptive to offers of buyouts, and that's why the city of San Francisco came out with an ordinance to regulate buyouts.
That's a great segue. Let's talk a little bit about that ordinance and about its effect and how to comply with it.
So basically, the city, lawmakers, and a lot of tenant advocates were concerned about the number of buyouts that were going on in the city of San Francisco. They didn't know how to quantify it. They didn't know how many buyouts were going on. But myself and my colleagues, we were doing a lot of buyouts, to the point where we were doing more buyouts than serving eviction notices on things like owner move-in evictions, where a client wanted to move into the unit or the tenant was being a nuisance. But even in non-payment of rent situations, we were doing buyouts. And the city, they keep track of evictions. You have to file your eviction notices at the rent board, so they know how many owner move-ins are going on, they know how many Ellis Act evictions are being processed, and how many eviction notices for nuisances are being served. But they weren't tracking the buyouts, and they were concerned that a lot of people were moving out of their units in exchange for money, and that somehow they were being harmed. And there was a concern that landlords somehow were getting the better end of this deal because tenants are uninformed about what their rights are and what the value of their unit might be. So they passed a law that regulated these buyouts. I should also point out that historically, buyouts were not permitted in San Francisco because there's a piece of the rent ordinance that says a landlord may not endeavor to recover possession without serving an eviction notice that states just cause. And buying the tenant out because you want to give them money is not just cause. It's not just cause. So landlords were being sued for trying to do buyouts, suggesting tenants leave their units, and then there was a Court of Appeal decision that my office was involved with, Baba versus Superior Court of San Francisco, which kind of opened the floodgates to buyouts. Because what the court said was that landlords have a right of free speech. The First Amendment, they can approach a tenant and talk to them without fear of being sued for a wrongful eviction. Well, that was the go-ahead to make offers to tenants to buy them out. And so from about 2002, when that BABA decision was decided, through 2015, when the buyout ordinance went into effect, there were a lot of buyouts. We're never going to know how many buyouts there were. But now we know how many buyouts there are, at least that are being recorded at the rent board. What the rent board and what the Board of Supervisors will do with that data is unclear. But they may use it to clamp down on buyouts in the future.
And so why is it a problem in San Francisco for tenants to accept a sum of money in exchange for moving out of their apartment and going somewhere else?
Well, I don't see anything wrong with it, and neither do the tenants who are taking the money. It's a win-win situation. But the tenant rights advocates, they don't think that tenants could think for themselves. They need help. They're getting the raw end of the deal. When in fact, a lot of the people that we've done buyouts with, they took the money and bought a home to live in. Which is a good thing. Home ownership is generally seen as a good thing.
Not here, but everywhere else it is.
Well, and it's a good thing because you don't have to worry about that knock at your door someday.
I'm here to ask you to leave. Exactly.
So there's security in home ownership.
Now, let me just clarify. In most circumstances, they're not necessarily getting enough money in a buyout to buy a house in San Francisco. But a lot of times it happens to coincide with a plan. The tenant was thinking of moving back home to be with family anyway. They're not from here in the first place, and then they decide to leave. And it seems like the tenant advocates are saying that the fabric of our San Francisco community is being torn apart by having people being forced out of San Francisco because their landlords are asking them for buyouts, when it's really just a free exchange of money for value in any other circumstance.
Well, I've heard that the community is being broken apart, but the community of San Francisco has changed a lot over time. And I don't know if it's the buyouts that's changing the fabric of San Francisco community or the kind of people that are working here now, but San Francisco has always been in a state of flux as to
Right.
who the community is here.
Right.
And there are a lot of people who want home ownership. They don't care if it's in San Francisco, San Mateo, or Walnut Creek. They want to own their own home.
Right.
That's still the American dream, even for San Franciscans.
Right.
So generally, if the money you're getting in a buyout is not enough, it might be enough to close the deal if you have some savings, or it might be the beginning of your savings,
Right, your nest egg.
so that you can purchase a home.
So now the buyout ordinance has some new wrinkles to the way that conversation would go. It used to be that the landlord would approach the tenant and say, "Gee, I'd like to talk to you about giving you some money in exchange for you moving out. Would you be interested?" And there were some circumstances where that conversation sort of went awry, and the ordinance tries to avoid those potentially intimidating situations for tenants. Tell me a little bit more about how the buyout negotiations work and what landlords need to be aware of when they start that conversation.
So the new ordinance regulates negotiations between landlords and tenants and the agreements that are ultimately entered into.
Right.
So what is a negotiation? The ordinance regulates negotiations, and there's a definition in the ordinance. It's a discussion between a landlord and tenant where the tenant vacates in exchange for money or other consideration. I still haven't figured out what the other consideration might
would be. Yeah, I don't know how else you would compensate somebody for moving out of their apartment, but
I'm sure some case will come up one of these days. But usually the tenant is looking for money to vacate, and that's what the landlord is offering for the tenant to vacate. So I've had questions like, well, what if I don't talk and the tenant does all the talking? Well, that might still be a discussion between the parties. I think we all know what a buyout negotiation is. If there's any suggestion the tenant vacate, you're probably crossing the line, and the ordinance applies to that situation. The one time where it doesn't apply is if the landlord and tenant are in the middle of an unlawful detainer action, an eviction lawsuit in court. And if there's a settlement agreement and there's negotiations over that agreement, that's exempt under the buyout law.
So that buyout agreement doesn't have to be filed at the rent board, and that data doesn't get entered into
correct.
The record.
That's correct. So the other regulation has to do with the agreement and what has to be in that agreement. So the difference between the old law before there was a buyout ordinance and now is that the landlord cannot initiate negotiations or sign an agreement until they first disclose to the tenants a whole bunch of their rights under the buyout ordinance and the rent ordinance, and the landlord has to notify the rent board that they're about to enter negotiations with the tenant.
So not that there's an agreement, but just that you're about to have the conversation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the rent board, ultimately, they keep statistics on how many times landlords have initiated the buyout process, and they have separate statistics on how many agreements were actually entered into after the landlord initiated the process. And it looks like it's like 40 to 50% of the time a negotiation does end up in a buyout, which is a good thing. They're like grown-up people working out a deal, and yet this is a very unusual law. I don't think you can find many laws that regulate negotiations and agreements between the parties, but San Francisco is a very different place.
Yeah, San Francisco is an unusual place where things like this are heavily regulated and very contentious. So you have a variety of different data that your office has compiled as a part of a study on buyouts, and what's interesting to me is that part of your information has to do with San Francisco and part has to do with the East Bay. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how much has been expended on buyouts and other data that are interesting.
Okay, so let me explain where this data comes from. First of all, part of the buyout ordinance requires landlords to file their written agreements with all the terms of the buyout at the San Francisco Rent Board for the world to see.
Right.
And that's where we got our data from. The Rent Board is not very good at assembling that data and coming to conclusions, but my office was able to do that by taking the data and taking the time just to assemble it in a meaningful way so that landlords would know what the going rate is. Because that's the first question I get from a client about a buyout is, what does it cost to do a buyout?
Right.
So the other town that also collects statistics this way is the city of Berkeley, because they have a buyout ordinance. So we can compare Berkeley and San Francisco, the different amounts. There are a lot of buyouts going on in Oakland, but Oakland doesn't have a buyout ordinance, and they don't have a database that we can go to and come out with an average or a median buyout price.
Okay.
So there, the numbers are more anecdotal than anything else. So the buyout ordinance went into effect in March of 2015. So we've taken the data from March 2015 through the end of 2016, and our numbers are based on that. And what we've come up with is that the average buyout throughout the city of San Francisco is $38,000, with a median buyout price of $30,000, and that's per unit.
Okay.
There could be 1, 2, 3, 4 people in that unit, but the average is $38,000, median is $30,000.
And that amount of money, if you have 4 people living in a unit, is split among the 4 people. It's not per person, it's
Correct.
per unit.
Yes.
Okay.
In a moment, I'll talk about the factors that go into these numbers, like why does one landlord pay $38,000, another one pays $100,000? Well, it has to do with various factors.
Yeah.
The total amount of buyouts for 2015 through 2016 was $25.5 million.
Wow.
That's the money that went from landlords to tenants. Now, we're talking about dollars that were reported to the rent board.
Right.
These numbers assume that every landlord that does a buyout is informing the rent board that
Right.
they're following this buyout ordinance.
That the landlords and the tenants are both perfectly informed about the ordinance and its requirements. Right.
And I don't think that's the case. I think there are more buyouts going on. I think
Right.
there are landlords and perhaps their attorneys who are ignoring the buyout ordinance
Right.
with the belief that you can't have an ordinance that regulates contracts in this way, or that prevents owners from initiating a negotiation, because that's a violation of free speech and a violation of that BABA decision from 2002.
Right. Right.
And my practice is to advise landlords to follow the tenant buyout ordinance.
Right.
It would be very risky for me to tell a client, ignore it, you have free speech rights, and then the city goes after the landlord for violating the ordinance.
Right.
So comparing with Berkeley, in Berkeley the average citywide buyout number is $24,000 with a median of $19,000. So there's a big difference between Berkeley and San Francisco, and it has to do with the markets.
Right.
Berkeley still has a large turnover of
Right.
tenants every year.
Right.
Students come to school in the fall and then they leave during the summer.
Right.
So they have turnover of units, and that probably has a big impact on the market there. In Oakland, we don't have any actual numbers, it's just gut feelings, where tenants are paid between $6,000, maybe $10,000 to leave a unit. All right, getting back to San Francisco, so we have a median of 30,000. That means half of the buyouts were above 30, half were below. And we've kept statistics by zip code, and we have found that there's a lot of buyout activity in the Mission District, Noe Valley, and the Castro District. For some reason, and it would take a realtor to explain why there's a difference between those communities and the marina. And it could be that, well, the marina is already, the rents are close to market, whereas there's more upside opportunities in the Mission, Noe Valley, and the Castro. We have seen buyouts that have gone for over $100,000, and a lot of people look at that and say, that's ridiculous. Well,
Why would anybody do that?
Well, it's because basically you're buying the tenant out, you're buying out their lease and their possession on a very expensive property right. That's going to be, probably be someone's home after the tenant buyout goes through and the tenant vacates.
Right.
And what a home selling for in San Francisco?
Right.
A lot more than $100,000. So if you look at those cases where large amounts of money were paid, it was probably because the owner needed an empty unit, not because the rent was low. They needed an empty unit so
To sell it.
to sell it or to owner occupy it, and
So
it made sense.
it essentially turns out that the landlord is cutting the tenant in for a piece of the sale proceed in advance of the sale, and sort of sharing the wealth, as I think tenant advocates and tenant attorneys would say, pay it back to the tenant for doing something that makes you a lot of money. Share the value of that, even though the tenant has absolutely no risk and has done nothing except stay in the same place to earn that right. That's the perspective, I think, on the other side.
Well, they're also the beneficiaries of rent control. I mean, laws
Right.
were passed that give them the possessory right along with a great economic benefit.
Right.
So the argument is, if you want to take that benefit away and you're going to profit on that, or somehow your property is going to increase in value,
right.
share it.
Right.
So not all landlords feel that way.
Right.
And that's what the negotiations are about. And the tenants, they'll argue, well, we're elderly, disabled, or catastrophically ill, so we should get more money. It's harder for us to relocate. The landlord might say, yeah, but you're only one person in that unit. The numbers that are those big numbers at the rent board, those are situations where there were many tenants occupying one unit, more people that needed to be relocated.
Right.
So other factors that go into what these numbers are, what the buyout amount is, has to do with it does have to do with the rental rate of the unit.
Sure.
There's some landlords that are only getting $500 for a $3,000 apartment,
Right.
and they may have bought that property recently, and the property is not cash flowing. So definitely rental rates go into the equation. The cost to actually relocate the tenant. If the tenant, they don't have any other home, their family's back east, they may have to move back to New Jersey. That's a bigger cost of relocation than moving within the city or to the outskirts of San Francisco. And then there's always the extraordinary needs of the landlord and the tenant.
Right.
That's an important factor that's not always considered. Like, a landlord may have a buyer for the building, but they'll only buy the building if there's an empty unit.
Right.
So the landlord might be willing to pay a little bit more to get that empty unit in order to close a deal.
Right.
Or the tenant may have extraordinary needs. The tenant, they may have been thinking about vacating anyway.
Right.
And buying a house in San Francisco, somewhere outside of San Francisco, but they needed an extra $50,000 for a down payment.
Right.
And that's an extraordinary need that the tenant has that could also go into the equation. They'll refuse to move unless they get that extra $50,000. So the landlord doesn't always know what all the factors are on the other side.
Right.
They know their situation, and they got to take those factors into consideration when deciding how much to offer.
Now, part of the free speech issue that goes into this is that, in a hypothetical situation, probably a fairly common situation, a landlord approaches their tenant, says, I'd like to talk to you about a buyout. The tenant maybe never even thought about leaving, maybe never thought about how much money it's worth to them, and the tenant just says, no, I'm not interested. In the past, before the ordinance, it seemed there were landlords who would push that issue and then get into intimidation or harassment of some sort. How does the ordinance sort of avoid that kind of situation?
Well, the buyout ordinance really doesn't, but there's another ordinance in San Francisco, the anti-harassment ordinance, that limits landlords into how many times they could offer a tenant to vacate for money.
Right.
It's another interesting law that seems to violate that BABA decision. That's free speech.
Right.
What's the difference between making an offer to a tenant once a year or 10 times in a year?
Right.
The city's attempted to call repeated efforts at a buyout harassment. That hasn't been challenged in the courts.
Oh, okay.
So no one's been sued for violating that provision in the anti-harassment ordinance. But generally, tenants, if they say no, landlords will accept that. They know what no means.
Right.
But there were stories before they passed the anti-harassment ordinance about tenants being repeatedly harassed. I wasn't aware of that happening. I'm not sure there were any concrete examples of that ever presented to the Board of Supervisors, but now the law is on the books.
Right.
So if a tenant doesn't want to engage in buyout negotiations, they don't have to, and they're told of that right. When a landlord initiates the process and gives them a whole list of the tenant rights and the lawyers they can go to and the organizations they can go to for advice, they're told you don't have to accept a buyout.
Right. If you don't want to proceed with the conversation, don't sign the affidavit that the landlord sends you saying that you're ready to start, and the landlord shouldn't be contacting the tenant after that point to ask for that again until after the tenant. So the procedure is that there's a notification that goes to the tenant, and the tenant has to affirmatively sort of opt into a negotiation over a buyout, as opposed to avoiding the landlord's advances in that circumstance where the landlord could keep contacting them. The landlord is supposed to stop contacting them about a buyout until the tenant has signed and agreed that they want to hear what the offer is. They want to hear what the terms would be. They want to hear what they'd have to do in order to get the money and how much money they could stand stand to gain. So there's some structure around that. Now, as far as the written agreement goes, it seems to me like there are some positives and some negatives around having a written agreement in the first place. I mean, positive is you know exactly how much money, the tenant doesn't get the check and say, that's not how much money I expected. And it also protects the landlord against the tenant getting the check and saying, no, I think this is good, but I think I'd like a little more. But what are some of the downsides to having a written agreement on the landlord and tenant side, both?
Well, there have been a lot of buyouts where there was no paperwork, no paper trail.
Right.
And the tenants saw that as a good thing because maybe they didn't declare it on their taxes.
Taxes, okay.
Or maybe there was someone else in their life that they didn't want to know that they were getting a buyout. They
like
were
a
getting
roommate,
cash.
yeah.
A roommate, a spouse.
Yeah.
Or some government agency where
Right.
they're getting payments on a regular basis, and they're not supposed to have that extra income like that.
Right.
So, but from the landlord's point of view, it's good to have the agreement in writing because then you can include language in there that limits the landlord's liability for violating the buyout ordinance, release language, things of that nature.
Okay.
The downside to the landlord of having something in writing is you have to file that agreement with the rent board, and the
Right.
whole world will know your business.
Right.
They're going to know your name.
Right.
By the way, the tenant's name on these buyout agreements, when they're filed, it's redacted. It's crossed out with
Right.
heavy dark ink.
Right.
So no one knows who the tenants are, but I guess it's important to the lawmakers that the landlord's identity be known.
Right. Well, the lawmakers seem to regard every landlord who's doing this as a complete scofflaw and scoundrel, whereas the tenants are the babes in the woods not knowing what they're doing. So that's
Right.
sort of the assumption of the law.
Yeah, and I think it's a false assumption because there are a lot of avenues for tenants to be apprised of their rights. There's an entire
Right.
rent board that's set up to cater to tenants and to give them information and to actually give them the names of attorneys and organizations that will help them.
Right.
Under this buyout ordinance, there's a provision that allows certain nonprofit tenant organizations to actually go after landlords,
Right.
and collect attorney's fees for going after landlords who violate the buyout ordinance.
So you don't have to be a tenant who's directly affected by a violation of the ordinance. Gee, my landlord was, continuing to harass me over a buyout that I didn't want. It can be a outside organization that gets wind of this and decides to attack a landlord in that regard.
Or worse, it could be a tenant who voluntarily and happily entered into a buyout agreement and the landlord didn't file it at the rent board. Well,
Oh,
that's
goodness.
a violation of the ordinance.
Yeah.
And an organization like the Tenderloin Housing Clinic go
Right.
ahead and file a lawsuit, or the city attorney could file a lawsuit for that violation and collect all of their attorney's fees.
Oh.
So, but the point is that there's a lot of information available to tenants, advising them of their rights. Not so much for landlords.
Well,
So
that's
why
where you come in.
That's where I come in, but you don't have to pay a lawyer. You shouldn't have to pay a lawyer
Right.
to find out what your rights are, and that's why I think it's good for people to join the San Francisco Apartment Association, because you get all of this information for free
Right.
by being a member, and you can read articles, and
Yeah.
the organization will keep you up to date on changes in the law.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There's another thing I wanted to point out about buyout agreements that's an important element, and that is the tenant has a right of rescission.
Right.
They have to be told about that right of rescission. The right has to be in the written agreement that's filed with the rent board. And what it says is the tenant has 45 days after everyone signed the agreement to back out of the deal.
Right. And the money's been paid, or at least some of the money has been paid to the tenant.
Maybe not.
Ostensibly, maybe not.
It depends on how the deal was made.
Right.
I would advise against a landlord paying all the money that's due under the agreement
Up front.
up front
Right.
before the 45 days
Keys
expire.
for cash is better.
Because good luck getting your money back if the tenant decides
To
to
rescind.
rescind.
Right.
You'd have to sue them in court.
Right.
So there's a 45-day right of rescission, and I know of no tenant that has ever exercised that right. I've checked with the rent board, I've checked with my colleagues who do buyout agreements. It just hasn't happened. So I don't know why it is that tenants are honoring these buyout agreements. It's an agreement.
Right.
But they don't honor their rental agreements for some reason. Maybe it's because of the money they're getting. The money's going a different direction.
That's right.
And they want that money. They want to honor the agreement.
Yeah.
If a tenant decides, to back out of the deal,
Right.
the landlord cannot enforce a buyout agreement.
Can't enforce by evicting the tenant
No.
for taking the money and signing the agreement and then not moving out.
You can't force the tenant out under the agreement if they decide to change their mind. It's
Right.
because the landlord still doesn't have just cause.
Right.
They might be able to sue to get their money back, which would be a lengthy process in court.
Right.
But the agreements in terms of recovering possession is probably unenforceable.
And for the cost of going to court to enforce and to get the money returned, we're not talking about $250,000. We're talking about, tens of thousands of dollars perhaps that would be paid and not returned. It's just too expensive to pursue that case for pretty much anybody. I mean, it has to be straight vindictiveness to try to get it back, or just, anger.
So with an average payout of, let's say, $40,000 right now,
Right.
and the standard of practice right now is to give the tenant half up front when
Right.
the agreement is signed, half when they turn over the keys. That means the landlord may have to chase the tenant, if the tenant rescinds, for a $20,000 payment that was made
Right.
up front,
Right.
which exceeds small claims court.
Right.
So you have to go out and hire a lawyer to get your $20,000 back.
And if you end up in a jury trial, it's $10,000, $15,000 in legal fees to get started, really. So a lot of what you've lost is going to be down the drain before you get started anyway. So
Low risk in tenants rescinding these agreements.
Right.
Because historically it just hasn't happened.
Right.
And the tenants who are represented by legal counsel, those legal counsel will make sure the tenant moves out in a timely fashion because they want their piece of the action.
Right.
They don't get paid.
Their attorney's going to get paid.
Yes.
Well, that sounds really interesting. And if you're interested in getting more information from Clifford and his office, you can get all their data. Give Clifford a call, send him an email, go to his website at freedwilliams.com. We'll put a link to Clifford's office website and all of his contact information in the comments below. But feel free to give Clifford a call if you have any questions about buyouts or the Costa-Hawkins challenge. And we're really glad to have had this chance to have a conversation about the current state of affairs with buyouts and the Costa-Hawkins challenge efforts. So thank you very much for joining us today, Clifford. It's been a pleasure having you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm J.J. Panzer, your Smart Apartment Advisor, reminding you that even though life is short, it pays to take the long view. Take care, everybody. See you later. If you have any questions or you'd like to know more about the Costa-Hawkins defense, you can go to Clifford's website at freedwilliams.com. And if you'd like to help support the cause of defending the Costa-Hawkins at the state level, please go to the San Francisco Apartment Association's website and make a contribution to the legal fund. The URL is here on your screen, and we'd be happy to have your support in that regard. Thank you very much.